Okay, so we're back. We're going to start Tractate Menachot today. This is the Daf Yomi cycle, so we're in Daf 2. The tractates do not start with the Daf 1, page 1. They start on page 2. And basically here, this is talking about like meal offerings. So the meal offerings are typically some sort of combination of flour, oil, and frankincense. So basically. We're going to start here with the Mishnah. The Mishnah introduction a little bit to the Mishnah. It says, when one brings a meal offering to the temple, the priest removes a handful from it. And it's kind of like, I don't know how to, they kind of like pinch it, right? Handful from it and places the handful in a service vessel, conveys it to the altar and burns it. At that point, the remainder is permitted to the priest for consumption. The owner has fulfilled his obligation. In this context, the Mishnah teaches all the meal offerings from which a handful are removed, not for their sake, but for the sake of another meal offering, are fit for sacrifice. But these offerings did not satisfy the obligation of the owner, who must therefore bring another offering. This is the halacha with regard to all meal offerings except for the meal offering of a sinner and the meal offering of jealousy. So jealousy is like the sota, right? Which is brought as part of the right of a woman suspected by her husband of having been unfaithful. So the sota, yes. In those cases, if the priest removed the handful not for its own sake, the offering is disqualified. So with regard to the meal offering of a sinner and the meal offering of jealousy, so that's the sota, from which the priest removes a handful not for their sake, or where he placed a handful from them in a vessel, or conveyed the handful to the altar, or burned the handful on the altar, not for their sake, or for their sake and not for their, or for their sake and not for their sake, or for their sake and for their sake, they are disqualified. So the Mishnah elaborates, how are these rites performed? For their sake and not for their sake? It is in a case where one removed the handful with two intentions. So for the sake of the meal offering of a sinner and for the sake of a voluntary meal offering. So how are these rites performed not for their sake and for their sake? It is in a case where one removed the handful with two intentions, for the sake of a voluntary meal offering and for the sake of the meal offering of a sinner. Okay, the Gemara now says, the Mishnah teaches all the meal offerings from which a handful was removed, not for their sake, but for the sake of another meal offering, are fit for sacrifice, but these offerings did not satisfy the obligation of the owner. So the Gemara asks, why do I need the Mishnah to teach, but these offerings did not satisfy the obligation of the owner? Let it teach simply, and they did not satisfy the obligation of the owner. Why does what does the word elah, meaning like did not, add? The Gemara responds, by adding this word, the Mishnah teaches us that the only deficiency of these offerings is that they did not satisfy the obligation of the owner. But the meal offering itself is valid, and it is still prohibited to deviate from the protocol of its sacrificial process. For example, if a handful was removed from a meal offering not for its own sake, it is prohibited to also burn it not for its own sake. So this halacha is in accordance with the statement of Rava, as Rava says, with regard to a burnt offering that one slaughtered not for its own sake, it is still prohibited to sprinkle its blood on the altar not for its own sake. So the Gemara adds, if you wish, propose a logical argument to support the statement, and if you wish, cite a verse as proof. The Gemara elaborates, if you wish, propose a logical statement. Just because one deviated from the protocol in its sacrifice once by removing the handful, could it be that he could continue to deviate from the protocol in all of the rest of the sacrificial rites? So one deviation does not justify additional deviations. If you wish, cite a verse. Quote, that which has gone out of your lips you shall observe and do, according to what you have vowed as a gift offering to the Lord your God. And it continues, that which you have promised with your mouth. So Deuteronomy 23:24. So the Gemara analyzes this verse. It says, is it a gift offering? It is a vow offering. Why does the verse first call it a vow offering and subsequently call it a gift offering? Rather, the verse teaches that if you acted in accordance with how you vowed, so if you sacrifice the offering for its own sake, your obligation to fulfill your vow will be fulfilled. But if you did not act in accordance with your vow, it does not fulfill the obligation incurred by the vow and will be considered a gift offering. Okay, the Gemara concludes the proof from the verse, and with regard to a gift offering, it is permitted to deviate from its protocol ab initio. So clearly one may not do so. Accordingly, if one of the sacrificial rites of a meal offering was performed for the sake of a different meal offering, it is still prohibited to perform any of its other sacrificial rites improperly. So the Mishnah teaches that all the meal offerings from which a handful was removed not for their sake are fit for sacrifice, but they do not fulfill the obligation of the owner. The Gemara suggests, let us say that the Mishnah is not in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Shimon, as it is taught in Braita that Rabbi Shimon says, all the meal offerings from which a handful was removed not for their sake are fit for sacrifice, and they even satisfy the obligation of the owner. The Braita continues, conversely, consecrated animals that were sacrificed not for their sake do not fulfill the obligation of the owner, as in this regard meal offerings are not similar to slaughtered offerings. The difference is that when one removes a handful from a pan meal offering for the sake of a deep pan meal offering, its mode of preparation proves that it is in fact for the sake of a pan meal offering, as the two offerings differ in appearance. Similarly, with regard to a dry meal offering, the meal offering of a sinner, which contains no oil, whose handful is removed for the sake of a meal offering that is mixed with oil, its mode of preparation proves that it is for the sake of a dry meal offering, and one's improper intent is therefore disregarded. So with regard to slaughtered offerings, it is not so, as there is one manner of slaughter for all offerings, and one manner of sprinkling the blood for all offerings, and one manner of collection of the blood for all offerings. Since the differentiation between slaughtered offerings is established only through intention, one who sacrifices an animal offering not for its own sake does not fulfill the obligation of the owner. So Rabbi Shimon apparently disagrees with the Tana of the Mishnah on two counts. First, he claims that if the handful of a meal offering was removed not for its own sake, it satisfies the obligation of the owner, whereas the Mishnah teaches that the obligation is not fulfilled. So second, Rabbi Shimon does not differentiate between the meal offering of a sinner or the meal offering of jealousy or the sota and the other types of meal offerings. So the Gemara comments, this works out well, that is, the Mishnah can be explained in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Shimon. According to Rav Ashi, who says, upcoming here in the Gemara, in resolution to two apparently contradictory statements of Rabbi Shimon, here, where Rabbi Shimon says that the meal offering is fit and fulfills the owner's obligation, he is referring to a case where one states that he is removing a handful from a pan meal offering for the sake of a deep pan. That is, he mentions only the vessel, not the type of meal offering. Conversely, there, where Rabbi Shimon says that the meal offering does not satisfy the owner's obligation, he's referring to a case where one states that he is removing a handful from a pan meal offering for the sake of a deep pan meal offering. Accordingly, it can be explained that the Mishnah is referring to a case where one removes a handful from a meal offering for the sake of another meal offering, which is why it does not satisfy the obligation of the owner. But according to the statements of Rabbah and Rava, who resolved that the contradiction in a different manner, what can be said? The Gemara elaborates, and if you would say that the contradiction addressed by Rav Ashi is resolved as Rabbah answers, this is problematic. Rabbah resolved the contradiction as follows. Here, where Rabbi Shimon says that the meal offering satisfies the owner's obligation, he's referring to a change of sanctity, that is, it was sacrificed for the sake of another type of meal offering, whereas there, where Rabbi Shimon says that it does not fulfill the owner's obligation, he is referring to a change of owner, that is, the meal offering of Ruvain was sacrificed for the sake of for the sake of Shimon, somebody else, right? The Gemara explains that the reason this is problematic is that if one accepts Rabbah's resolution, how can the Mishnah be explained in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Shimon? So the Mishnah is clearly discussing the case of a change of sanctity, as it teaches how are these rites performed for their sake, and not for. How are these rites performed for their sake, and then not for their sake, whereby the offering does not satisfy the owner's obligation. It is a case where one initially removed the handful for the sake of the meal offering of a sinner, and then for the sake of a voluntary meal offering. So this is a change involving a different type of meal offering. So, and alternatively, if you would say that the contradiction addressed by Rav Ashi is resolved as Rava, not Rava, but Rava answers, this is equally problematic. So Rava resolved the contradiction as follows. He says here, where Rabbi Shimon says that the meal offering satisfies the owner's obligation, he is referring to a case where one removes a handful from a meal offering for the sake of another meal offering, whereas there, where Rabbi Shimon says that it does not satisfy the owner's obligation, he's referring to a case where one removes a handful from a meal offering for the sake of a slaughtered offering. So the Gemara explains that if one accepts Rava's resolution, the Mishnah cannot be in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Shimon. The Mishnah is discussing a case where one removes a handful from a meal offering for the sake of another meal offering, as it teaches how are these rites performed not for their sake and for their sake. So it is a case where one removed the handful for the sake of a voluntary meal offering and then for the sake of the meal offering of a sinner. So the Gemara concludes, rather, according to the resolutions offered by Rabbah and Rava, it is clear that the Mishnah is not in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Shimon. So the Gemara cites the Braita that is the basis for the apparent contradiction between the statements of Rabbi Shimon, which was mentioned in the previous discussion, and a sage raises a contradiction from one statement of Rabbi Shimon and another statement of Rabbi Shimon as it is taught in Braita. So Rabbi Shimon says that the verse written concerning the meal offering, quote, "It is most sacred as the sin offering and as the guilt offering," Leviticus 6:10, and indicates that there are some meal offerings whose halacha is like that of a sin offering, and there are some whose halacha is like that of the guilt offering. So Rabbi Shimon elaborates, the halacha with regard to the meal offering of a sinner is like that of a sin offering. Therefore, if one removed a handful from it, not for its own sake, it is disqualified, just like a sin offering that was slaughtered not for its own sake. Conversely, the halacha with regard to a voluntary meal offering is like that of a guilt offering. Therefore, if one removed a handful from it not for its own sake, it is valid, like a guilt offering that was slaughtered not for its own sake. So Rabbi Shimon adds, and a voluntary meal offering is like a guilt offering in another aspect as well. So just like a guilt offering is valid, but it does not affect acceptance, that is, it does not satisfy the owner's obligation, so too a voluntary meal offering is valid, but it does not affect acceptance. So Rabbi Shimon here apparently contradicts his ruling that all meal offerings from which a handful was removed, not for their sake, satisfy the obligation of the owner. So Rabbah said in resolution of this contradiction, it is not difficult. He says here, where Rabbi Shimon says that the meal offering satisfies the owner's obligation, he's referring to a change of the sanctity. That is, it was sacrificed for the sake of another type of meal offering, whereas there, where he says that it does not fulfill the owner's obligation, he's referring to a change of owner. That is, the meal offering of Ruvain was sacrificed for the sake of Shimon. Okay, so Abaye said to Rabbah, now consider that the fact that the merciful one disqualifies a meal offering due to improper intent is derived from the Torah's comparison of meal offerings to sin offerings and guilt offerings. So if so, what difference is there to me if there was a change of sanctity? And what difference is there to me if there was a change of owner? In the case of a guilt offering, either of these changes prevents it from satisfying the obligation of the owner. So Rabbah said to Abaye, the claim that its mode of preparation proves one's intent, which Rabbi Shimon states, in explanation of why offerings are disqualified through improper intent, is based on logical reasoning, as Rabbi Shimon interprets the reason behind the mitzvah in the verse and draws halakhic conclusions based on that interpretation. So Rabbah continues, this is significant, as Rabbi Shimon holds that the merciful one disqualifies improper intent that is not recognizably false. So when the intent is not, when the intent is not clear in contradiction to the sacrificial rites performed. So the intent to sacrifice an offering for the sake of another owner does not include a change in the sacrificial rites, and it therefore disqualifies the offering. So the merciful one does not disqualify improper intent that is recognizably false and contradicts the sacrificial rites performed. So if one removes a handful from a pan meal offering for the sake of a deep pan meal offering, as the different substance itself indicates that it is a pan meal offering. The Gemara lists several questions with regard to Rabbah's statement, for which it provides a mnemonic. So the mnemonic is burnt offering, pinched, squeezed, bird sin offering, offerings of the most sacred order, and offerings of lesser holiness. The Gemara first asks, but if that is so, that only intent that is not recognizably false disqualifies an offering, then in the case of a burnt offering, where one pinched the nape of its neck above the red line that divides the upper and lower halves of the altar for the sake of a bird sin offering, it should affect acceptance according to Rabbi Shimon. So the reason is the actions performed on it prove that it is a burnt offering. Because if it is in fact a bird sin offering, he would have performed the pinching below the red line while standing beside the altar. Nevertheless, Rabbi Shimon agrees with the ruling of the Mishnah in Zavachim 64b that this bird offering does not satisfy its owner's obligation. So the Gemara rejects this. Is that to say the case of a bird sin offering that is pinched above the red line is not possible? Didn't the master say the pinching of a bird sin offering that is performed in any place on the altar is valid after the fact? Accordingly, there is no discernible difference between the pinching of a bird burnt offering and the pinching of a bird sin offering, so the owner's obligation is not fulfilled. The Gemara raises another difficulty. If recognizably false intent does not disqualify an offering, then a bird burnt offering, where a priest squeezed its blood above the red line for the sake of a bird sin offering, should affect acceptance, as the actions performed on it prove that it is a bird burnt offering. Because if it is in fact a bird sin offering, he would have performed the required act of holding the body of the bird and sprinkling its blood below the red line instead of squeezing out its blood above that line. And that is the end of Daf 2.